We're almost done for the section, but we have another bug, or not really a bug, but a behavior, which I want to get rid of. If we are on a recipe detail page like this here, recipes/2, and you reload, you get an error. You get an error that it can't read the property ingredients of undefined, and the bigger problem here is not related to the ingredients, but simply that we tried to load the detail page for a recipe which doesn't exist because we're fetching our recipes from a backend. And if we haven't pressed fetch data before, well, then we simply have no recipes, so accessing the details of our recipe is doomed to fail. Now, there are different ways of making this work. One, of course, would be to simply add a guard that prevents us from accessing recipes/2 or the edit route, which also has an ID encoded in the URL, when we have no recipes loaded, and instead redirects us to just /recipes, for example. That would be one way of doing it. We could use such a guard, but we can also use, yet a guard, but another type of guard. We can use a resolver, which are also covered in the routing module. A resolver is essentially some code that runs before a route is loaded to ensure that certain data the route depends on is there. That sounds like a good idea to me. I'll add it in the recipes folder next to the recipes component, and I'll name the file recipes resolver.service.ts, because it is a normal Angular service in the end. In there, let's export a class which should be named recipes resolver service, and this will get the add injectable decorator, because it is injectable in the end, and injectable, as you learned, needs to be imported from @Angular core, and this will then get the provided in root object here to provide it application-wide automatically. Now, the recipes resolver service now needs to implement the resolve interface. Now, resolve is also imported from an Angular package, of course. It's imported from @Angular router. Now, resolve is a generic interface, which means we need to define which type of data will resolve in the end. And in our case, that will be the recipe data, so an array of recipes. And for that, let's also import recipe from the recipe model here. So our resolver will in the end run some code that loads some recipes. We now need to inject our data storage service here, because that is the service that will make the HTTP request. So I'll name it data storage service here of type data storage service, which now also needs to be imported up there from the shared folder, and there the data storage service file. And now the resolve interface forces us to add a resolve method here, which gets data about the route, the activated route snapshot, which is imported from the Angular router, and which gets the current routing state, which is of type router state snapshot, which is also imported from @Angular router. From there, we could get information like the ID we're requesting, but I'm not interested. I want to load all recipes anyways. Otherwise, things like editing them won't work correctly because we need to reinsert them into the array and so on. And therefore, now here, the goal is to return either an array of recipes, which we can't because we need to load it first, or an observable that will in the end yield an array of recipes. And that is something different. That is something we can offer. For that, let's have a look at the data storage service. There we have fetch recipes, and right now we subscribe in here. We just have to tweak this a little bit. I still want to set the recipes in the recipe service from inside fetch recipes, but we can simply do this by adding another RxJS operator, the tab operator. And the tab operator also needs to be imported from RxJS operators. The tab operator allows us to execute some code here in place without altering the data that is funneled through that observable. So in here, we will get our recipes array indeed, and I will simply set the recipes in the service then, as before. But now I will not subscribe here anymore, but instead return this call to this HTTP service. And that means that in the header component, we now have to subscribe here. And you don't even have to pass in a function if you're not caring about the response anyways. So therefore, here in the header component, this change, of course, is a bit redundant. But it's now really helpful here in the resolve method, because here we can now return this data storage service fetch recipes. Now, please note that I'm not subscribing here, but I'm simply not subscribing here because the resolver, this Angular feature, will subscribe for me to basically find out once the data is there. You can ignore this error. It's my IDE not understanding that this is valid. So now we should have a valid resolver that loads the data before this page is loaded. So let's now fetch data, open the Summer Salad and reload, and we still fail. Now obviously because we're not applying the resolver. So let's now go to the app routing module where we have our two paths that rely on a recipe being loaded. And on both these paths, we now have to add the resolve key, which is an array of resolvers. And there we should add our recipes resolver service. And that now needs to be imported. So let's import recipes resolver service from /recipes. And then there it's that recipe resolver service file. Now let's add that same key, that same key here to the recipe added component. And now Angular will run this resolver before loading this route. So now if I reload this looks much better. And now that data is here, because now what we do in the end is we run through that resolver our data storage service fetch recipes method whenever this route gets loaded. And that is super helpful and important here to ensure that our data really is there when we need it. And therefore, even when editing this, if I reload this edit route, this also works. It takes a bit longer to load because the data needs to be fetched first, but since Firebase is super fast, this is no issue. And now we prevent nasty bugs by us loading data which is not there, because now it is there. And as you learned, of course, saving data and fetching data also works, so that now we can freely delete our recipes as we want. We can always fetch them again, unless we saved again after deleting, of course. If I do fetch my recipes and I try to edit one of them, for example, I want to add an exclamation mark here, you see that these changes are not saved. And the reason for that is the resolver, which is used whenever we visit the recipe detail route. It fetches new recipes from the server, and that simply overwrites our existing recipes, including our changes to these recipes. Now, the solution is to first check whether we do have recipes and only fetch new ones if we don't. So I can inject my recipes service here, like this, import it from recipe service. With this injected, we can get our recipes from this recipe service get recipes. And now we can check if recipes length is equal to 0, then this means we have no recipes and we should fetch them. Otherwise, if this is not 0, we can just return these recipes, because then, well, we do have recipes, so no need to fetch them again. With that change, we can still reload the page whilst we're on it, but we can also, of course, reload the app somewhere else and just fetch data. But now, if I edit this, indeed the changes are saved. If I reload, and I then get my old data, because I didn't save them to the server before my changes, but they were saved locally, and if I would have chosen save data, we would have also saved them on a server. So this is a tiny adjustment which we should make to avoid strange bugs. One thing we haven't covered thus far in this course is authentication. Now, of course, a lot of modern web applications require users to authenticate. That means to sign up and log in, at least to use certain features of these applications typically. And it's also something we can add to our application here. Thus far in the course project, in the recipe book, we're not using authentication. We always interact with our backend where we store our data in an unauthenticated way. There is no feature in our application that would require authentication. Therefore, in this module, You will learn how you can add authentication to an Angular application, how it works, and how to make sure that you lock down parts of your application or the entire application with authentication.